oxygen and the ketogenic diet, which which both affect mitochondria tremendously. So let's talk about what mitochondria are, and then we'll get an idea of how both of these things, which are so different, are tools that help heal the mitochondria. Mitochondria are the power sources of your cells, and you get mitochondria from your mother. So when a sperm and an egg come together, the sperm doesn't bring any mitochondria, and all of the mitochondria are in the original egg cell. So if we were to trace ourselves all the way back to Eve, we get our mitochondria from Eve. So all the powerful men in the world and all the powerful women in the world have mitochondria that go back to a female. Mitochondria, the number of mitochondria per cell gives that cell its power. As we find out more and more about mitochondria, we find out that there are deficits of mitochondria in cells, but there are also deficits in function in mitochondria. Mitochondria have their own DNA, and mitochondria divide when the cell divides. And so if there isn't enough energy in the cell for the mitochondria to also divide, our number of mitochondria can decrease. The more that we understand about what goes on in the brain and brain illnesses, we understand that it's often a deficit in mitochondrial function. So the number one thing that helps mitochondria function is oxygen. The second thing that helps mitochondria function is ketones. And then the third thing is sugar. And so we think we are taught biology in school, and we're taught that sugar is what the brain runs on. The brain actually prefers, and the mitochondria in the brain prefer ketones. So that's how we're going to make that segue about how oxygen works on mitochondria and how ketones do. So I think I'll talk first about oxygen therapy for anyone with a brain illness, anyone with metabolic illness. If I can provide more oxygen to you, it is like coming to a small city that is struggling to build roads, struggling to build bridges, struggling to build schools, struggling to keep the structures of the community up. And I say, you now have an unlimited budget. Think about that. So suddenly bridges would be built, suddenly new roads would be built, suddenly there would be schools and factories that the community could invest in. The same goes for your body. So right now, healthy or unhealthy, your brain has a bunch of work orders in to the central processing and is saying, look, if we just had more energy, we could build a bridge here. We could build new neuronal networks. We could build new blood supply. We could build a healthier organ. We could heal this wound faster. We could get things done. So please bring us more oxygen. Well, I'm sitting there going, breathing really hard, but I can't get the amount of oxygen in my blood up any further by breathing more. The amount of oxygen that my blood contains is dependent on my number of red blood cells and the number of hemoglobin molecules per red blood cell. And that is wonderful, but it's a limited number. What if I could dissolve oxygen into the fluid that carries my red blood cells? Now, even, I'm breathing at room air, I'm breathing, and I've got 100% saturation of my red blood cell oxygen carrying capacity. If I could dissolve oxygen in my serum, I could now get that increase in delivery of oxygen to all of my tissues. And I could make more energy and I could feel better. So what we do is under pressure. So there's a law in physics that says that under pressure, gases go into liquid. And one of the gases that goes very easily into liquid form in the presence of pressure is oxygen. So I get into a pressurized area, and it's as though I were diving down to 20 or 30 feet below the surface of the water, and the pressure that I would experience underwater is the kind of pressure I'm experiencing in the tank, the hyperbaric oxygen tank. At the same time, I've got a mask on my face and I'm breathing oxygen. That oxygen goes into the fluid that carries my red blood cells, and now I'm delivering more oxygen to my tissues. Within 20 hours of doing this, so you might come to the clinic and go into the hyperbaric chamber 1 hour a day, 5 days a week. So after about 4 weeks, 20 hours, I have an increase in the circulating stem cells. So we all want to get more stem cells because we know that stem cells help us stay younger and help us heal organs and help us feel better and help us heal our tissues faster. And people spend $30, $50, $100,000 traveling to some other country to have their stem cells drawn out of their body and expanded. Well, I can get my own stem cells by getting into a hyperbaric chamber. And after 20 hours, I have 500 to 800% more stem cells. So go back to that analogy about the city that wanted to build bridges but couldn't get the finances to do it. Well, now I've got the finances to do it. I've got that extra oxygen. And what was the first thing I did? I went to my bone marrow and I said, hey, we've got the budget. We need those stem cells so that we can build new tissues. We can build new vascular systems. We can build new neurological systems. And so I might be healing my brain. I might be healing an organ that isn't working. I might be doing something that my body knows how to do but didn't have the budget to do. So that is why I'm such a huge proponent of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. It is safe for children. It is safe for adults. The contraindications for getting into a hyperbaric chamber would be, the big one is any holes in your lungs. So if someone has lung disease, if they have metastatic cancer to the lungs, if they have a pleural effusion, if they have had previous surgery on their lungs, I need to assess them very, very, very carefully to make sure their lungs won't collapse in the hyperbaric chamber. The other contraindication would be someone with an ear problem that is serious. So if they have a cold or a flu and they have buildup of fluid in their ear because their eustachian tube's not draining their ear, they could be at risk for the rupture of an eardrum. There are times when someone is so sick that we don't care. We actually put them in the chamber anyway, and we recognize that they might have rupture of an eardrum, but we decide that that's a risk that we can take because the eardrum can heal. The third contraindication is serious seizure disorders. And this is actually fungible because we're understanding that even the lowest pressures, even the pressures that in many studies have been used as the placebo. Okay, so there are some studies in hyperbaric oxygen therapy showing that placebo is as good as treatment, but that was because placebo was also treatment. So it turns out that a lot of doctors who do hyperbaric medicine think that we start at 2 atmospheres or 20 feet below the ocean in the chamber, that we want the chamber. So I just want to clarify that in case someone misunderstood or they just signed in. The chamber does not go underwater. The chamber sits in an office or in your home, and the pressure is generated by a compressor that is pushing air into the chamber. So you don't have to go underwater. So going back to the studies that were done, there were scientists who wanted to show that hyperbaric therapy worked, but they didn't know how to do a placebo. So they picked the lowest pressure that they knew of, which was 1.3 atmospheres, and decided that that was essentially the same as staying in room air. It turns out that for neurological problems, the way to treat is actually 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres. At 2 atmospheres or above, which is where so much of the treatment for wounds and so much of the treatment for the bends had gone on, that treatment actually causes seizure disorders and had prevented anyone from thinking that neurological disease could be treated in a chamber, because it would put people in at 2 or 3 or 4 atmospheres and they would have uncontrollable seizures, they would have oxygen toxicity, and it wasn't helpful. But the placebo group at 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres actually improved. And so it was thought placebo was better than treatment, so we shouldn't treat. But in fact, those people were being treated. So we're treating a lot of children with autism, even children with autism who have seizure disorders, at 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres. We are treating people who have had strokes. We're treating people who have had seizures at 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres and finding that they do very well. Ask me some questions about hyperbaric therapy. Something must have come up in your mind as I'm talking. Do you have any questions?
Does anybody have any questions?
I do. I was wondering if it would be used for somebody who has a hole in their heart. I know you mentioned hole in the lungs, but I was wondering about holes in hearts.
So someone that has a hole in their heart is having trouble delivering oxygen to the tissues in their body. Their heart, because of the hole, has become an inefficient pump. And so if I could put more oxygen in their lungs and get more oxygen into their serum, in the fluid that carries the red blood cells, they could actually get oxygen to areas of their body that hadn't been seeing it as much as they wanted to. So that person with the inefficient pump is really struggling with that budget problem that we were dealing with that poor little city that couldn't build roads. And so I think, a child that's got a hole in their heart is fatigued easily, is struggling with growing because there just isn't enough of a budget. And a child with a hole in their heart might tremendously benefit from a chamber in their home at 1.3 atmospheres. Of course, every case is different from every other case, and there are risks and benefits. And so that each case would have to be evaluated. But I think this would be an excellent adjuvant therapy. Very interesting, in Russia, they are doing open heart surgery in a atmosphere that is pressurized. So they are using a operating theater that is itself a hyperbaric chamber. So the patient is on oxygen, everyone in the room is breathing room air, but they're breathing room air at 1.3 to 1.5 atmospheres. They've even gone up to 2 atmospheres for heart surgery and shown that the patient doesn't have the problems with the pump that can cause brain damage because there's an increase in circulating oxygen in the patient. So patients do better with post-pump syndrome, and surgeries go better because there's more oxygen, so there's less risk of infection. So someone was trying to come in my door. And patients do well. They're also doing neurological surgery in some countries in a hyperbaric chamber operating theater. So there is no question that increasing oxygen is tremendous. Oh, one more thing about hyperbaric therapy. We focus on the idea that inflammation is a root and a cause of disease. Very often a child will even be diagnosed with having inflammation in the brain. All of us know that autoimmune disease, heart disease, and even cancer is often related to chronic inflammation. The number one way to get rid of inflammation, the fastest, is to put someone in a hyperbaric chamber at 1.5 to 2 atmospheres. Inflammation is related to the mitochondrial dysfunction, the mitochondria not being able to clear out the situation. And when I give the mitochondria more oxygen, they're able to do their job. And so people do better. Okay, did that help, Jenny?
Absolutely. Thank you for your expertise.
Dr. Womack, I wanted to bring something to the attention too, especially of some of the mothers listening and those that we've kind of been talking with, that I think this might be something that they would be interested in a therapy for their children. The question's been brought up, can they get in the chamber with their child if the child doesn't feel comfortable getting into the chamber? Is that something that's you're able to do?
That's an excellent question, and I actually want to digress a little bit and talk about the 3 kinds of ways that the public can get hyperbaric therapy, okay? The first way that we alluded to, but we haven't really been talking about, is in a hospital. Almost every large hospital has a very high pressure hyperbaric chamber that costs to insurance somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 per hour. This chamber is capable of going to 6 atmospheres. The person who is running that chamber is a hyperbaric physician, probably related to the Navy, who has been she started out treating her patients with the bends, which is a disease caused by extended periods of time underwater, breathing oxygen and nitrogen. The bends is caused by the dissolving of nitrogen as a gas into the blood, and then when the patient comes up too fast, the nitrogen can give them strokes. So those patients are treated for 2 or 3 days in a hyperbaric chamber at 3 to 4 atmospheres to get the nitrogen back dissolved in their blood and get it out of their blood. Those people are the people who also treat wounds and treat the 14 different diseases that are covered by insurance. Those people do not treat below 2 atmospheres, and those are the people who are kind of opposed to the other 2 forms of delivery of oxygen. So the other 2 are the kind of chamber that I have, and then the home market. I will start with my chamber. My chamber goes from 1.3 atmospheres to 2 atmospheres. It is a large metal device. So it looks like, going back to the Beatles, it looks like the yellow submarine, except it's blue. I have 3 of them, and they are 9 feet long and 4 feet tall, so 4 feet in diameter. They're like circular submarines. They have windows in them, and they have lots of little knobs and things. And children actually love to look at them because they look like submarines, and they're blue, and they're kind of cute. And those chambers are definitely, you could have a mother, a father, and a child in there. And I have found that lots and lots of children love to be in there with their mom because mom has no distractions, and mommy and child are 100% available to one another, and they can play. And the child is allowed to move around inside the chamber and have a great time. There is another kind of a chamber that is available to the private pay market. And that is a chamber that is pressurized with oxygen. Oh, that was one other thing. These chambers in the hospital are pressurized with oxygen. And the reason why there isn't any experimentation and any extension of their application to other patients is because every dive puts everyone in the hospital at risk, because the whole thing can blow up because it's pressurized with oxygen. And that makes that a very dangerous therapy. So nobody wants to do anything no one wants to do an experimentation to find out what other kind of applications there could be for this kind of science. There are, in my market, some smaller chambers that are also pressurized with oxygen. In those chambers, you need to take off all your clothes, take off all your jewelry. You can't have on nail polish. You can't have hairspray. You can't have anything that might rub and cause a spark, because the whole chamber will blow up. In those chambers, it's very difficult for a mother and a child to get together because of the rubbing of skin and the rubbing of clothing, even though both people are wearing paper. So children have to be held very tightly, and it doesn't always work so well. In our chambers are not pressurized with oxygen. They're pressurized with ambient air. You could light a fire inside of one of mine and cook an egg. I've actually seen the demonstration done, and there's no blowing up. There's not enough oxygen in the chamber to blow up. There's enough oxygen going into the person through the mask, but there's not enough ambient oxygen in the chamber. There is also a market for a very similar kind of chamber that you can buy for your home. And that's the third market that I would talk about. These are not bombs. They're not pressurized with oxygen. They're pressurized with ambient air. Their surface, instead of being metal, is cloth. And because of a cloth, we can't go any higher in those chambers than 1.3 atmospheres. But 1.3 atmospheres is very helpful to many children and to many adults with illness. You tend to need to spend more time in them. So really you need 2 hours a day for the kind of therapy that you would get at 1.5 to 2 atmospheres. But it's a very, very affordable, very wonderful way to get hyperbaric oxygen therapy. And there are every town has got an underground group that is putting together their resources and buying a chamber for, say, 3 to 4 families, and then they trade the chamber around. So one family will have it for a month and a half, and their child is getting treatment every day, and then it's time for the child to have a natural break in their therapy, and the next family gets it, and then the next family gets it, and then it comes back around. Those chambers cost anywhere from I'm going to give you the good chambers are $20,000. So 4 families or 3 families could afford to put money into a $20,000 chamber for their children to rotate through. You can also buy them used, although I don't necessarily recommend that. To the cost of doing work in our chamber is $100 an hour if you're buying 20 to 40 hours. We also have a foundation that helps support and undergird people that can't pay. So those are the three markets, and those are the ways that people could do this affordably. Did I miss anything, Talia?
That seems like it got it all. Thank you so much. I just wanted them to know I have done this as well as Cheyenne. And like you said, Cheyenne loved when we'd go in the chamber together because it was undivided attention, but we used it for her health issues. And then I was recovering from the, from mono and my broken leg. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there, that it is a child and mother bonding experience, or father.
Yes. Yes. And I had a patient in her 20s who had a horrible brain accident, and her family took turns bringing her into the chamber and actually doing exercises with her in the chamber. So she would do leg lifts and she would do arm exercises, and her family members who were in there exercising with her, actually all of them, even though they were getting a third of the treatment, reported that they felt better and were sleeping better and had better digestion. One of the really unique things that I've discovered is that I can put a patient with this is just addressing the inflammation issue. I think I'm going to move on from here to the ketogenic diet, but I can take patients with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease who are in the midst of a flare and get them into hyperbaric maybe 2 hours the first day and then an hour a day following that. And within about 6 to 7 hours, their flare has gone down because of the anti-inflammatory properties of oxygen. So I'll leave that with you and go on and talk about the ketogenic diet. Okay, so we talked about one of the things that mitochondria love, which is oxygen. The other thing that mitochondria make ATP, which is it's the energy currency of the body. And so they need oxygen as part of that chemical reaction, and then they need something to start with. And their substrate, or the thing they start with, that we're taught in school, is they start with glucose. So we always see this picture of a mitochondria, and we see glucose going into it, and we see energy coming out of it. Well, it turns out that that's a little bit deceptive on the part of our education system, because they picked one reaction and they skipped the other one. The other one that's really exciting is that the body can use fat to fuel the mitochondria. And when we use fat to fuel the mitochondria are about 28% more efficient in producing energy. So I want to take us all back to the concept of evolution. And I know that there are lots of Christians listening to me who would, but let's just suppose that God's involved in evolution for a moment, or let's just suppose that this is a wonderful, wonderful way to talk about this, and it might be fiction. But if we say that human beings, humanoids, took about 1 million years to develop into the intelligent beings that we are, that there were creatures that walked around and then became intelligent. During that time, they were eating fat. There were no sources of starch. There were no sources of carbohydrate that were readily abundant. Yes, every once in a while, we would find a patch of blueberries, or we would find a patch of blackberries and gorge for two or 3 weeks, during which time we would have to use our insulin system and our mitochondria would have to use some glucose. Or we would find a big honey tree. We'd find a bee tree, and those who were brave enough in the tribe would go harvest honey for everyone else to eat, and we would put on fat, okay? And there is definitively a system within the body to, when we're exposed to sugar, to put on fat. And everyone knows that when we eat junk food, we get fat, okay? It turns out that the preferred fuel for our bodies is what we evolved with, which was fat. And our bodies are not actually designed, as the endocrinologists talk about, to secrete insulin every 3 to 4 hours in response to a carbohydrate meal. Now what I'm saying is the truth, but it is completely the opposite of where medicine is right now. Interestingly enough, in the 1920s and 1940s in the United States, the #1 treatment for seizures in children was to restrict glucose completely. And they actually fed those children fat, and the children grew, the children progressed, and the children's seizures went away. And so there is a big field within neurology. There are not big, I will say that there are pockets within neurology that still uses the ketogenic diet to treat seizures that are intractable. But now we only use the ketogenic diet when the medications that treat seizures don't work. And so we don't use it as a first line thing. We use it when the medications don't work. But we all know that the medications have terrible side effects. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could do ketogenic diet for seizures in all children? There is another place where the ketogenic diet is very, very, very controversial. And so here I am stepping off the end of a long plank. But in the treatment of initial onset diabetes in a child. So this, I'm now not talking about diabetes type 2, I'm talking about diabetes type 1. So this is a child whose islet cells have been attacked by their own immune system and they can no longer make insulin. It looks like treating with a ketogenic diet early in that process may actually slow the attack on the insulin producing cells and may actually preserve some insulin function, which is very, very, very important in the current time, because it may be within the next 4 to 10 years that we will actually have a cure for type 1 diabetes based on the fact that there's some islet cells still available. And so anything that we can do to preserve islet cells in children with new onset diabetes is really exciting to me. But there is a tremendous amount of resistance because, again, science has been taught from high school, college, and I was taught in medical school that glucose was what fueled mitochondria. Okay, so let's go back to how we would do this. So what is fat? Where is fat found? Well, fat is found both in the animal and in the plant world. We have all cooked chicken soup and seen that there's a big layer of fat. We've all made a beef stew and found that there's a big layer of fat. We also know that there's a huge movement within the vegan community that says, don't eat any animals because their fat is toxic. Guess what? Those vegans are right. Okay, so if I take an animal and I force feed it corn in a feedlot, and that animal is sick and requires antibiotics and requires hormones in order to grow because I'm only feeding it corn, and that in fact that poor cow actually has cow diabetes and cow hyperlipidemia, that cow is a sick cow. If we go back to the Bible, we're told not to eat sick animals. So the vegans are absolutely right. The fat from those sick chickens that are force-fed corn and those sick cows, I would not want to feed my child. And if I had a choice, I'd rather give them glucose than that kind of fat because that's not healthy for them. So if we're going to do animal fat, we need to look at healthy animals. And those healthy animals are grass-fed, they are free range, they are antibiotic free, they are hormone free, they are, if they're fish, they are wild caught or they are farm raised with crickets. So feeding a salmon corn actually will make that salmon make toxic fats. So don't feed your animals corn, don't force feed animals, let them eat what is natural. The plant sources for fat are pretty fabulous and very abundant and very safe. Avocados would be on everyone's first list. The next would be coconut oil. And coconut, and there are lots of fats derived from coconut oil, including MCT oil, which is quite famous right now. And in fact, MCT oil and coconut oil are very close to being ketones, and so they can usually help someone who's trying to get into ketosis stay in ketosis. Other sources of clean fats from plants include nut butters and nut fats. I would exclude from the treatment of any sick child any exposure to peanuts because peanuts contain lots of mold and other contaminants. So those nuts I wouldn't be there, but walnuts would certainly be there, pecans would be there, Brazil nuts would be there, macadamia nuts would be there. So nuts can be a very healthy source of fat. I would say that within the vegetable sources of fat, the toxic fats that I would avoid would have to do with any fat from a plant that is cooked. So if I am getting olive oil out of an olive, and during that time the olive oil is heated, that will pervert and change the fat into something that's not as healthy. I want cold, that's why the whole concept of cold pressed olive oil comes from. I would not want to use canola oil. All canola oil that's sold in the United States is heat processed. So no canola oil. I would not use Wesson's vegetable oil. I wouldn't use a vegetable oil because those are all heat processed. But if something says cold pressed on it, and you believe the company that says that it's cold pressed, then a cold pressed oil is a healthy oil for an adult or a child. So now I've got my kind of panoply of fats. I can certainly use chicken fat from a free-range chicken. I can use lamb fat from an organic farmer who's letting the lamb graze. I can use beef fat from grass-fed free-range beef. I can use fat from a pig that is raised without antibiotics in a free-range area. And those are the hardest animals to find because almost everyone force feeds pigs and then lets them out for 2 days and calls it pasture raised, but it's not. So finding a safe source of pork fat's difficult, and that's difficult because we all love bacon. So bacon is a wonderful fat, but try to find a clean pig. You can at your local farmer's market find clean pigs. And you might even want to visit and see how those pigs are raised. So now I've got my clean fats. What am I doing in the process of starting the ketogenic diet? I am offering more fat to my patient, my child, myself, and I'm restricting carbohydrates. And I think that probably should be done in a stepwise fashion because we need to make it fun and we don't want to make dramatic changes. And I would phase out carbohydrates over about a month while I am feeding protein and feeding fat and feeding. To the extent that I'm feeding carbohydrates, I'm still getting those from vegetables. So a diet that has lots of vegetables and lots of meat and lots of fat would be the beginning of a ketogenic diet. It is interesting, and I think the number one problem in getting someone on a ketogenic diet who has been eating lots of carbohydrates and whose body naturally wants to look for carbohydrate, that body will take protein and make it into carbohydrate or make it into sugar. And so one of the number one problems in getting someone on a ketogenic diet is that they will overeat protein and actually have spikes in their blood sugar instead of staying with their blood sugar nice and even and living on fats. And I think that's super duper difficult in a child. And for me as a physician, the number one way that I do this is I actually recommend that my patients measure their blood for ketones. So now we've got a child, if the child's diabetic, that actually quite easy because you're already measuring the child for sugar, so you can measure for ketones as well. If I'm as an adult or as someone that's just volunteering to do this and doesn't have a blood sugar issue, I'm now submitting you to sticking your finger, which is never fun for a child and may actually be the thing that keeps you from doing it. On the market, there are a couple of companies that make a way that you can detect ketones in the breath, and those are expensive. They start at $400, and I think the best one on the market is $700, and actually has a monthly cost that goes along with it because of calibration needs. But it can be done with exhaled breath, so you could do ketones without finger sticks that way. You have to monitor whether or not the patient's making ketones. If the patient is making glucose out of protein, then you will see that they are not in ketosis. And you have to know it, so you have to measure it somehow. There is available on the market urine testing strips for ketones. Those don't work. Now listen carefully. Those don't work past the 3rd week of ketosis. So they work in the initial getting into ketosis, and they're very helpful, but they stop working when you really are in ketosis. And so many people come to me terribly frustrated saying, I used to have ketones in my urine and now they're gone. Well, that person's actually in ketosis, so they don't see them in their urine anymore. It's during the transition that we see ketones in the urine. So what does an average day of food look like for a child or an adult on a ketogenic diet? The adult might actually skip breakfast. The child, I think, is going to have a breakfast that would involve 1 or 2 eggs with some bacon from a clean pig, without a carbohydrate there, but probably some spinach or some kind of a cooked vegetable, and that would be satisfying and pretty delicious. The lunchtime thing would be vegetables, probably with some of that animal fat on, and a small portion of protein. And that protein for a child that's not dairy sensitive could even include a piece of cheese. If the child is, or the adult is dairy sensitive, then I'm going to do the ketosis without dairy, except maybe ghee, where the proteins, let's talk about butter for a second. Butter has dairy proteins in it, and butter can be very destructive of people who are dairy sensitive. There is a way to remove the dairy proteins from butter, and that is something called ghee, which is spelled Ghee, and has been made for years in India. It is a fat that doesn't go bad. So we're in a small village where there's no refrigeration, they could boil the butter and scrape the proteins off the top and then have a fat that could sit for months and not go bad. And that's what ghee is. And ghee is a wonderful source of fat and a wonderful source of ketones for someone who wants to be in the ketogenic diet. So you could have a serving of vegetables with a small serving of protein, and those vegetables could be covered with ghee. Those vegetables could be covered with duck fat. Those vegetables could be covered with chicken fat. All of these coming from clean animals. And then a snack in the afternoon could be some very delicious fatty nuts, like walnuts or pecans or Brazil nuts or macadamia nuts, or there's a very strange nut called a pili nut, P-I-L-I, pili, P-I-L-I. Pili nuts come from Malaysia and from the Philippines, and they grow on trees that are 70 feet above the ground, and they've never been exposed to any kind of pesticides. They're a great source of magnesium. It's a nut that's very low in carbohydrate and very high in fat content. Children love them, adults love them. They are expensive, but they are a phenomenal source of the kind of fat that can keep someone in ketosis. So that might be an excellent snack either for the afternoon or for the evening. If there's an additional meal, that person might have something very similar to lunch, which is a small serving of protein, again, vegetables with fat on them. Vegetables that might take you out of ketosis, oh, my favorite, butternut squash, which will actually spike my insulin. Butternut squash you could serve in a small serving. So there are some sweeter things, but I would make them in small servings. Carrots might take you out, potatoes might take you out. Vegetables that won't take you out for sure out of ketosis are spinach, chard, kale cooked. So greens that are cooked, or for those who are young and very healthy and can digest, you can do them as salads. I'm in a sick individual, this is one of my hacks. This is not about the ketogenic diet. This is one of my things that makes me stand apart, and I think actually is one of the tools that really helps people, is the recognition that the digestive process is one of the things that your mitochondria really have to budget for every day. Making hydrochloric acid in your stomach for the digestion of food is the biggest energy thing you do. Everybody, if I were to say, where do your mitochondria work the hardest to make energy? A lot of people say, well, it's my brain because I'm thinking all the time. It's actually your stomach. Your stomach is where you make acid that digests your food. So when someone is sick and struggling, if someone's been in a hospital for 3 or 4 months, there is no way, even if they are 11 years old, that they're able to make the stomach acid required to digest their food. And so many people have digestive disorders because they think that raw food or salads are the only thing that's healthy. Someone has told them that cooking food takes the nutrients out of food. This could not be farther from the truth. Truly, your nutrients come from digested food. So even that person who's juicing and eating all these salads, that person is actually cooking that food. If they're doing it successfully and they're claiming that it's the greatest health boon in the world, they're cooking that food in their stomach before it goes into the small bowel for assimilation. So please, if your child is sick and you're struggling, try taking them off of raw food, even raw juices, and get them onto food that is cooked and cooked well. So when I talk about eating greens, which I adore, I love spinach, I love kale, I love chard, I love beet greens. I cook these things for 20 minutes in the pressure cooker or 2 hours on the stove until they're really pre-digested and my system can assimilate them. One of the things that does as well is improve my gut flora, because the thing that my bacteria in my colon want to eat more than anything is digested, cooked, sterile plant matter. And now my bacteria can help me and aid me in the production of nutrients. I can make B vitamins. I can make vitamin K. I can make those vitamins in my colon because I don't have all of this digestive distress from the raw vegetables fermenting in my small bowel and ruining my ability to assimilate nutrients. Okay, so that was free. That was independent of hyperbaric. That was independent of anything about the ketogenic diet. That's just my philosophy on cooked food. One more thing. Oh, I got to do this. If you were found languishing in the middle of the Saharan desert by some wild and crazy witch doctor, okay, they'd scoop you up in their arms and they'd hover you over to their hut and they would wipe your brow and bring you, hover over you with rattles and wait for you to have the first flicker of consciousness. And when you did, would they bring you a salad or would they bring you a broth? They would bring you a broth, wouldn't they? They would not expect you to eat that salad. So if you are sick and recovering, yes, someday you will eat salad. But while you're sick and recovering, please give your body pre-digested food that's easy to eat. Okay, so there got to be questions. I know that I'm talking extemporaneously, and so I have probably missed 1,000 questions on the ketogenic diet. So please give me those questions now.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was just curious, for the ketogenic diet for seizure control in kids, is that something that you would have to commit to permanently, or is there a time frame that you would do it?
For the families with children who are if there's something being done, for example, a surgeon is evaluating that child with EEG in order to find the seizure focus and then to ablate that focus with robotic surgery. If that was going to happen, then the child would only have to be on the ketogenic diet until the seizure focus was eliminated. If the seizure focus is permanent, then the diet is fairly permanent.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I've got a question. Who should not do the ketogenic diet? Is there anybody that you'd recommend don't? Because I've heard multiple things about thyroid disorders and how it's not, it may be more harmful for thyroid disorders. Is that not true?
I don't think it's more harmful for thyroid, although it is tremendously energy draining. And there are all kinds of people diagnosed with thyroid when I think it's really an energy issue. And it requires discipline, and it requires lots of observation, requires lots of measuring, requires a lot of very careful assessment. So, I mean, I really would like people to test with breath or test with a finger stick after every meal to know whether that specific meal kept them in ketosis or took them out. So that if I'm already exhausted, if I'm already got chronic fatigue, and you ask me to do something like that, I'm going to mess it up. And I might make my health worse because I don't have the time to do that. And I find something that I like, and I think that it's on the ketogenic list, but it's actually not. So I don't talk about the ketogenic diet with all of my patients. If someone is in severe chronic fatigue, I actually want them to get protein regularly throughout the day at a higher dose. I want them to be taking their supplements. I want them to be resting. And then when they're feeling fabulous and feeling better and out of chronic fatigue, we might talk about it. I've had other patients who came and said to me, I've got chronic fatigue. I know my mitochondria are in trouble. Show me how to do this. And we've done it successfully because they were motivated to do the measuring. The ketogenic diet done improperly does the opposite of what it's supposed to do. It actually increases blood sugar instead of decreasing blood sugar.
Does it increase cortisol?
And it increases cortisol because it's stressful. Okay. Excellent.
I had another question too about it. How long does it take? I've heard some people get into ketosis pretty quickly, and other people it takes months for their body to actually start using the fat versus glucose.
So I'm a fairly healthy person, and it took me 8 months.
Really?
I'm older. I'm pushing 60. So I did this 2 years ago, and I've tried and failed. I think I was really successful probably about June of last year. So it took me a long time. And I was measuring labs that actually told me whether I was spiking, and I kept getting labs back that told me I was spiking. And I was spiking because I was eating too much protein. And I actually probably hurt my health during that time. Again, too much cortisol. So it is a very dangerous diet to do without proper supervision and without complete commitment, because we don't know about our own biology. Interestingly, for children, it is actually much easier if they haven't been fed a lot of sugar all the way through their lives, because children often fast without us knowing, and during that time, they go directly into ketosis.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have questions?
Anybody else have questions? So how about some book sources for the ketogenic diet? My favorite is called Fat for Fuel. Mm-hmm. And the author is a very, probably the most famous alternative medicine physician, Joe.
Is that Joe Mercola?
It's Mercola. So Joe Mercola's book really goes into the dangers and the benefits. And he has a very good induction diet. And he is non-dairy in that book. So he's not a proponent of dairy. The other book that is a little bit more fanatical, but actually I love this author, Nora Gedgaudas. Her last name is spelled Gedaudes. And Nora Gedgaudas has written 2 books, one called Primal Body, Primal Mind. And she actually, her love affair with the ketogenic diet came from about 20 years of working with children with delayed learning ability, ADD, ADHD, and seizure disorders. And she felt that fat was what made their brains grow. Fat was what made their mitochondria function. And so she put her children who worked with her on the ketogenic diet and found that they all got better. And she was very, very good at working with children. So the Primal Body, Primal Mind really goes into the science of fats. It is a very scientific book, and for a lot of people, it's too much. 10 years later, she found a marketing person who edited her book and made it into a different book, and it is called, it's got one of those names like Get Skinny and Eat Fat. But her second book is very easy to read, and also goes into an induction diet that takes 6 weeks. So she's got meal plans in it. The third book, which I recommend with tremendous fear, is a book by Jimmy Moore, which is called Keto Clarity. And that book does not talk about dangerous fats. So that book basically says, go to Luby's and load up on their bacon and eat all the fat. And it doesn't matter whether it's canola oil or it's dairy, just eat a lot of fat and eat out all the time and you'll be fine. And I think he's really talking to the community of people who has struggled with weight loss for 50 years. So the the 48-year-old or 55-year-old person who has been on 1,000 diets, that person could benefit from keto clarity because they could drop 100 pounds doing his diet his way. They would then have to go through Nora Gedgaudas and get a fat change and get rid of the bad fats that they've accumulated. But the book has over 40 different people chiming in, and they really discuss the problem of eating too much protein. And I address it very, very, very well. So those 3 books, and I would, if I was just going to buy one book, it would be Mercola's book because it is very safe.
So I've got a couple more questions that you might be able to address quickly, but what do you think, one, about people that don't digest fats well, and then 2, the keto salts, because they're everywhere.
Oh, those are great. Those are 2 great questions. All right. So we have this wonderful organ in our body called the liver. And the liver, of course, we know the tissue of the liver does all of our detoxification, or a large portion of our detoxification of bad things that could hurt us. And actually the worst things in the world that could really hurt us the most are fixed by the liver. And that's what's done in the tissue of the liver, cells of the liver. In between the cells of the liver is, organs have a blood supply that goes in and a blood supply that goes out. Well, the liver also has another whole set of network of vessels, and those vessels carry something called bile. And bile is where we put the stuff that we've packaged to get rid of. So those liver cells are working really hard to get rid of toxins. They make them fat soluble. They put them in this fatty substance called bile. Bile also has a kind of a soap in it that we make from old red blood cells. And that soap helps us digest and assimilate fats. And that's what bile is about. So let's go back and think about how we eat in the United States. So the SAD American diet, the standard American diet, that SAD diet is full of grains and it's full of foods that are inflammatory. And what they do is they swell up the tube that is our small bowel. So the bile duct is entering the small bowel at the very beginning of the small bowel. But if my small bowel is always swollen because I'm inflamed and I'm eating all this stuff that's not good for me, then it's so swollen that it backs up and then food is not moving through it. And then that food is just sitting there right under the bile duct. So the bile duct is trying to squeeze bile into the body, but it can't get it out because nothing's moving, because the whole small bowel is swollen. And so those people then go on to develop backup disease in their liver, which is called gallbladder disease. The gallbladder, doesn't empty regularly, can't empty against the gradient of pressure that's in the small bowel. And so that person has disease and may have their gallbladder removed. Now the bile juice is just dripping generally into the small bowel, but it may not be doing very well. The major symptom of that is the person has floating stools. Well, I recently have treated 2 patients, both without gallbladders, because they had been eating gluten all their lives. I took them off of gluten. I got them eating my cooked food and my soups and a diet that was like somebody who'd been caught on the Sierra Desert unconscious. And all of them said that their poop started to sink because now we had bile flow into the small bowel. Okay, so people that can't, the body knows how to heal itself, and the body desperately wants to make bile and put it into the small bowel. So if bile is not flowing and poop is floating in the toilet bowl, then the answer is we've got to address the inflammation in the small bowel so that bile can flow. There are some very rare conditions where there is no bile, and in those situations, we're not going to be able to feed that person fat. They're going to have to eat carbs and protein. So second question was ketogenic, keto salts. Okay, so here I am, this big proponent of paleo diet and eat what you can pick or what you can kill with a bow and arrow, and we want everything to be natural, and there's no keto trees. So there's no place that I could go and buy I can't go pick a keto salt. But I actually eat ketones myself. So ketones are a synthetic product. This is scientists understanding what a ketone is. What is it that the mitochondria wants to use? Just like we isolate sugar and we put it into a sugar bowl, you can isolate ketones and make them into a powder, and then you can mix that with water and you can drink it. And what happens within 20 to 40 minutes of drinking a ketone salt is your brain goes, ah, wow, And this is one of the reasons that that book by Jimmy Moore is called Keto Clarity, because ketones are what your brain wants to use. And when your brain gets those ketones, it's on fire, and you can get a lot of work done. And one of the reasons I'm so smart recently is that I do ketones probably 4 to 5 days a week as my morning snack, because I'm skipping breakfast. So it is a wonderful way. I would, if I were going to use ketones in the treatment of a child, I would do it under medical supervision, and I would only do it if I were measuring ketones in that child's blood. I would say that ketones in the treatment of a sick child has to be medically supervised by someone that's astute and understands, not by somebody who's just passing by. But in the treatment, in the assessment or treatment of an older person who wants to lose weight, and who can't wait around 8 months to become ketogenic, you could eat a very clean paleo diet that actually raised a little bit of your insulin in the evening, and you could do ketones for either breakfast or lunch and skip that meal and therefore cut out calories. And I've had some people do that hack and actually do fairly well in weight loss. And then I've had other people for whom ketones really disagree with their stomach. Please read the label. A lot of these ketone companies actually put some kind of a dairy byproduct in there. I don't know why they do that. And that's usually what makes people sick. If someone wants to start keto salts, for a healthy grown-up individual, cut it in half or cut it by thirds. Just do a little bit the first few days that you do it and work your way up. But if you have any gastrointestinal distress, check to make sure there's no dairy in it, and then do it in divided doses. There are companies out there that are charging literally $7 a serving. And there are companies out there that are charging $1.67 a serving. So also don't get ripped off.
What do you use? Which product do you use?
I actually sell the $7 one, but I tell everybody they can buy it where they can buy it cheaper. There is a company called Julian Bakery that sells it for $1.67 a serving. There's another company called Ketoned, which is an O with a straight line over the top of it, so Ketoned. And that company sells for about $2 a serving. The association between taste and the amount you spend is probably the only thing you're paying for. So if you can hold your nose and drink it down, buy the $1.67 Julian Bakery.
Okay.
Ketones don't taste good.
Yeah, no, they're not great.
No, they're not great. I don't think you can hurt yourself with them. And you can if you are starving. Just because you've eaten ketones doesn't mean you can't have an avocado. So.
Yeah.
And they actually make a great pre-workout.
Mm-hmm.
So you can take your L-carnitine and your ketones and have a great workout.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Okay, does anybody else have any questions? All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and it's so interesting, and I know we'll have lots of people listening to the recording as well. So